social suffering and outright politics, housing, financialization and institutional challenges in today's Spain. In recent decades, critical theory has largely discussed whether neoliberalism should be viewed as a set of biopolitical devices that radically alter the social experience and beliefs of subjects on a global scale, often punitively. This stage of capitalism has eroded the material and symbolic conditions necessary for livable life at a scale never before seen. From literal mass hunger to frustrating and unfulfilling work under precarious labor conditions, to the phenomenon of burnout, the cultural hegemony of neoliberal subjectivation depletes human energy and skills for the sake of producing human beings able to deliver unbounded productivity. Neoliberal politics implemented in southern European countries such as Spain have proven that the expressive moral economy, worked by Narozzi and Hanhart, for example, not only implies subaltern forms of livelihood, but also fosters practices and beliefs legitimating inequality, thus bringing about a sort of anthropological turn. In this paper, I aim to apply an immanent critique of capitalism to a recent societal evolution in Spain, where the chains of economic debt have tightened and quickly spread throughout different spheres of life, while at the same time the notion of political agency has grown. This cultural revolution has resulted in a surge in red wine, political and think tanks promoting the notion of a state with no responsibility for the economic suffering of citizens or for the care for children, disabled and the elderly, while also excluding certain bodies based on race and religion. This account of the state as a mere observer of market logic and structures intended to divide humans into the categories of hard-working or lazy, the latter generally associated with immigrant subjects, has become increasingly popular in the community of Madrid since the 90s, attaining its climax with the current leadership of Isabel Díaz Ayuso, a politician convinced of the social virtues of neoliberalism and intent on making them the common sense of this epoch. The case of housing financialization. Real estate violence played a central role in the assumption of the neoliberal anthropological turn in Southern Europe and the Global South, yielding similar effects in societies with different levels of development. It may be affirmed that housing financialization acts as a sort of homogenizing veil that has long obscured heterogeneous social patterns. The deep transformation that the construction sector underwent in recent decades, as Garcia Lamarca and Caica has worked, has spread the logic of rent into the sphere of commodification and consumption of housing. In a recent paper, Horta Mascaró inspected how the urban development of the community of Madrid, long governed by the conservative Partido Popular Party, displays a geopolitical vision of the national state, confirming the way that governmental bodies shape urban spaces and housing development policy. Moreover, urban development projects are considered a key feature of municipal politics, central to the political agenda of the autonomous community of Madrid. social fragmentation, and ideological colonization as a result of neoliberalism have been especially successful in this region of Madrid. As myself try to inspect in a recent paper. Contrary to popular belief, the state played a central role in housing commodification and financialization processes, shedding light on the neoliberal turn at a national level. Most of these changes are related to predatory lending offering, bank mortgages, and similar products to poor people usually deprived of a strong economic support net. The scope of public policies aiming to transform the moral economy of Spain have been more intensively surveyed by social scientists than philosophers. This is a matter of fact. In this vein, Jaime Palomera recently addressed the way housing booms, such as that of Barcelona's Ciutat Meridiana, this quarter of Barcelona, created obstacles for integration of precarious immigrant workers in buildings occupied by middle-class residents. He parsed the mechanisms implemented by the mental and practical colonization of the finance economy and its deep impact on the forms of life of immigrant people in urban Catalonia. The lack of interaction between social groups is a direct outcome of the neoliberal housing agenda, which favors a model of property acquisition and indebtment and impairs other modes of payment, as financial regulations determine access to the housing products circulating in the market. Palomera also provides an account of how financial regulations favoring real estate promotion led to the collapse of solidarity and mutual aid in precarious immigrant communities in Spain, insofar as these groups were targeted by being offered predatory subprime mortgages, one of the chief reasons for the financial crisis of 2008. Other empirical explorations carried out by Palomera and Betta highlight the resistance displayed by the losers of the housing crisis toward examining the true causes of their precarious situation, while also considering that resentment toward elites and institutional corruption may harbor some hope for political transformation within this social group. I would like to quote a passage from this work by Palomera and Betta about these changes of behavior determined by housing financialization processes. Ruined subcontractors did not generally challenge, they claim, the exploitative structure of labor relations in construction. Some of them did not even see subcontracting as a problem, and others actually wished they could have reached the position of privilege of their contractors above them. But the resentment that many of them showed towards elites, political corruption, and parasitic practices also opened the possibility of transformative antagonism. But they see this emotion as a promise of political mobilization, not as a matter of fact. The anthropological exploration of this economic sector confirms the interrelation between labor, financialization, and the making of a new model of citizenship, insofar as the ruin of certain sectors related to residential construction generates radical mental shifts for those whose existence relies its success. Thus, it's time to definitely choose the real estate model of business which idealizes the landlord and oppresses the tenant. This model should be viewed instead for what it is, the outcome of a distribution of roles whose epistemic framework jeopardizes the constitutional right to housing and reduces public development land. At present, very few in Spanish society expect that public housing programs on a municipal or regional scale might contribute to help increase available housing and thus make it easier for citizens to acquire a home of their own. In fact, the percentage of public housing in the country has become too scant to make an observable change in access to home ownership. In sum, the Spanish real estate sector has destroyed collective bonds and social interdependence through the pressure of finance bubbles impeding any experience of a real commonwealth, of a sound commonwealth. The sphere of housing financialization has also promoted the Thatcherist idea that we know very well, that society is made up of individuals and not of groups. Just as ancient bonds of solidarity frayed and broke as the result of the spread of the financialization in Spanish society, the social translation of emotions such as frustration, malaise, hate, and resentment also began to take. Sembra che... Scusate. Ich werde Deutsch. C'è un microfono acceso. Ok, it seems overcome. These feelings, frustration, malaise, hate, and resentment also began to take different directions. These feelings, unfortunately, don't always lead to political mobilization, but rather to the harassment of outgroups considered insufficiently representative of the country's ethnic, religious, and cultural traits. Salmeda and Fonchiv, two scholars that have very largely, very intensively analyze the influence of emotions in the construction of political polarization, have accurately analyzed the characteristics of these negative feelings. I quote from a recent paper from these two scholars. Right-wing resentment, they claim, at outgroups may be mediated by resentment. The repression of negative self-focused emotions, particularly shame, and the transformation of these emotions into anger, resentment, and hate at generic others, whereas left-wing resentment may emerge from the acknowledgement of social sharing of negative self-focused emotions, which allows and supports their transformation into anger and indignation at particular others, but also into pride, joy, and hope, similarly as in various civil rights movements. End of quotation. It's a matter of fact that the increasing financialization of the housing market has meant a substantial deterioration of the quality of lived experience of immigrants and racialized people, an evolution especially blatant in the case of Spanish society. As this marginalized group was immediately identified as a potential source of growth for the financial housing market, subprime mortgages were produced on a global scale to be offered to them. Moreover, the rational choice frameworks underpinning real estate loans and mortgages quickly isolated these people from their traditional networks of care and support, impoverishing their social life. Suddenly, outcast immigrant people in Spain began to take decisions about their lives under the cultural and economic pressure and ideological dominance of social finance, with the ideals of home ownership and white-collar jobs as a symbolic reference. At the same time, buildings occupied by majority immigrant tenants and by owners with unpaid mortgages began to be branded as dangerous ghettos destined to ruin the network of public services in the area, education, health, housing, and thus encouraging pure Spanish, into brackets, people to flee the area to guarantee their own welfare. The pervasive character of these beliefs and the hermeneutical injustice undergirding them succeeded in installing the fear of being too different or not normal enough in the eyes of the state, but also in the eyes of middle class, in this Spanish middle class. Naturally, the idea of the Santoro state, this powerful idea by Loic Bacon, spread a pervasive doctrine that determined the behavior of socially disparate subjects, confirming the capacity of the real estate sector to train the population to adopt values at odds with their traditional social experiences, especially in the case of immigrant people, as I said. Saving money, then, appears as a new ritual figure that the subject is required to perform at whatever price, exhausting the already low incomes of this vulnerable set of people. Alt-right populists and other conservative forces have quite perversely considered this vulnerable population as useful for both increasing the number of people indebted to banks and simultaneously in protecting the expectations of social advancement of the middle class, as immigrants suffer the harshest consequences of financial crisis. Thus, the uncivil pedagogy triggered by financialization does not extend basic economic rights, but rather fosters discrimination between normal and pathological social agents whose self-reliance and savings will determine their provisional inclusion in society. The inclusion in society and access to a minimum right to well-being and welfare is thus always indefinite for these marginalized groups. Some concluding remarks, and I will try to meet these 30 minutes we have each panelist. Neoliberal structures thus invest greatly in discourses narrowing the social and political imaginary of community, weakening trust in solidarity, the commitment to redistribution, and the universal right to basic social welfare. The main goal of this sort of behavioral device is to create a conservative backlash able to disavow the acknowledgement of any social indebtedness to leftist politics, for instance related to the universal right to health, housing or education, as mentioned before. On the contrary, leftist movements and achievements are depicted as wasteful uses of public money. Moreover, according to this ideology, the spending of tax money on social programs is deemed to be a betrayal, a kind of betrayal of the brave middle class, who feel embarrassed or ashamed for needing public sustenance, for needing public support, in contrast with the alleged tendency of immigrant people to behave as beggars. Even if this account of social pathologies concerning the European population, particularly of Southern Europe, presents itself as a neutral and objective perception of reality, the irrationality undergirding in this strategy of neoliberalism as a cultural environment uses emotions, and particularly set passions following Spinoza's language, Spinoza's ethics, to attain ideological hegemony. In this vein, the imperative of happiness, denounced by Sarah Ahmed, among others, as a steady pressure to exhibit existential success, reveals the dark side of Foucault's culture de soi, characteristic of our neoliberal era. In these circumstances, the subject is educated to interpret frustration as the consequence of personal faults and lack of effort. Other authors also highlight the wrath, rage, and anger that stoke the alt-right. I'm quoting a paper from Rico, Guinjuan, and Duisa, three Spanish scholars that have also intensively parsed the logic of alt-right populism. As they claim, angry citizens might be less likely to carefully scrutinize populist parties and candidates, meaning that efforts to combat fake news, a so-called post-truth politics, might not easily resonate with them. Instead, fighting against situations perceived to be unfair or morally outrageous could help to diminish the emotional state most fertile for populism. End of quotation. Yet we must also mention, as scholars such as Laura Quintana from Colombia, from the University of Los Andes, have insightfully claimed, the emancipatory drives that the aforementioned feelings may fuel in concrete circumstances of desperation and distrust in social institutions. We should not despise these emancipatory drives, the emancipatory drives that also appear in these sad passions or negative feelings. In these circumstances, common people decide to organize themselves according to the common goods available to them to guarantee the material conditions necessary for a livable life, in keeping with Butler's stress on the materiality of life, the material dimension of life. In this model of a struggle for life, the values of community and redistribution, rather than ruthless competition, orient decisions of individual subjects and also of groups. The effects of neoliberal cultural politics on Spanish society are manifold. Among them, the recent transformation of the state into an allegedly neutral observer state, charged with protecting people deserving of social recognition, while disregarding those marginalized and impeded from integrating into society, stands out. People exposed to contradictory class locations, as Eric Olin-Wright claimed, as is the case of all subjects under the hegemony of neoliberal rationality, develop an ambiguous relationship with the institutional realm as an effect of the discord they feel between their belonging to a social group and the set of beliefs and expectations they recognize as valuable. As has been claimed, the epistemic limitations of the useful expression moral economy, which will appear to refer only to equal and horizontal livelihoods and grassroots economies, also entails what Veronica Gago called an economy of obedience, which deeply jeopardizes the material freedom and dignity of human bodies on a global scale. To stage sound and lasting resistances against the havoc wrought by the neoliberal cultural revolution requires us to provide the space and encouragement for experiencing the interdependence involved in the preservation of a good life as a common commitment. This emancipatory agenda should accurately dissect the emotional roots of the making of the Homo economicus, forced to assume unpayable debts as an act of sacrifice toward the real estate market or to accept precarious labor conditions. Moreover, we must take into account the material genealogy of neoliberal dogmatic common sense, imposed globally by corporate lobbying that considers any popular dissent to be the result of an allegedly outdated leftist agenda. Popular resistance against neoliberal sacrificial demands should not be disavowed, but rather encouraged and recognized by institutions, albeit they reduced symbolic authority and capacity of coercion. In times of social suffering and upheavals against neoliberal inequalities, institutions must also meet the symbolic and material challenges they face in order to deserve popular trust and recognition.